I don't want to get caught out. That's the phrase. 5 simple words. But for investigators studying the murder of Michael Gaine, those 5 words might hold the key to everything. Michael Gaine was a 56-year-old farmer living in Kenmare, County Kerry, Ireland. In March of this year, he vanished without a trace. Weeks later, police found human remains scattered across his farm, brutally dismembered and dumped in slurry tanks. The horror of what happened to Michael shocked the entire community. But it wasn't long before attention shifted to one man, Michael Kelly. Kelly had worked on the farm for 3 years. He lived on the property. He was one of the last people to see Michael alive. And when the press finally interviewed him, instead of denying any involvement, Kelly said something much stranger. I don't want to get caught out. Now, what does a man mean when he says that? Why would an innocent person fear being caught out? Tonight, we break down Michael Kelly's exact words word for word to expose what might really be going on behind this brutal killing. Because sometimes it's not what someone says, it's how they say it. Michael Kelly is not just some random farmhand. He is an American citizen who had been living in Ireland for several years. He came to work on Michael Gaine's farm roughly 3 years before the murder. Over that time, Kelly wasn't simply an employee. He lived directly on the property, worked with Gaine daily, and was deeply involved in the daily running of the farm. By his own words, Kelly described himself as a very private person, and that privacy became extremely noticeable once the investigation into Gaine's death began. When Garda, Ireland's National Police Service, started looking into Michael's disappearance, Kelly quickly became one of the key individuals questioned. He was arrested, held for questioning, and eventually released without any formal charges. Despite not being charged, Kelly has remained under a heavy cloud of suspicion. His interviews with the press, especially the language he chooses, have drawn intense interest from both investigators and experts in statement analysis. In his most recent public interview, Kelly sat down with reporters to speak about the case, but instead of offering clarity, his words raised even more questions. As we go deeper into his exact phrasing, you'll see why many believe his own statements may reveal far more than he intended. In that same interview, Michael Kelly was asked a very simple, very human question. Are you grieving the loss of Michael Gaine? It should have been an easy answer. After all, Kelly had worked side by side with Gaine for 3 years. The man was brutally murdered. But Kelly's response was strange and cold. He began by saying, "Listen, man, I'm a very private person. I'm not going to get into that in the media. You know that's private. You can tell them I put ashes on my forehead. I don't care. You know what I mean? Stop. Come on, man. I'm not playing out anything for the public." Instead of simply saying, "Yes, I'm grieving," which would be a natural response, Kelly dodged the question entirely. He made the conversation about his privacy, not his emotions. He gave multiple negative statements. "I'm not going to get into that. I don't care. I'm not playing out anything." These aren't statements of grief, they're defenses. And there's something else deeply unsettling. When people truly do not care about something, they rarely feel the need to declare it. The fact that Kelly says, "I don't care," may actually suggest the opposite, that he cares very much, but doesn't want to reveal how. Even when speaking about the funeral later, Kelly showed no emotion, no sadness, no warmth, only cold, distant answers. For a man whose coworker was murdered in brutal fashion, this absence of grief raises serious questions about what emotions Kelly may be hiding and why. When Michael Kelly was asked how he felt about what happened to Michael Gaine, his words once again avoided any emotional or direct response. Kelly answered, "Yeah, well, I never thought that he would end up that way. It's a tragedy. I take it as a tragedy." This phrasing is incredibly important. Instead of acknowledging the brutal nature of the murder, the dismemberment, the disposal of remains in slurry tanks, Kelly softened everything into one vague phrase: end up that way. Experts in linguistic analysis note that guilty individuals often avoid directly naming the crime they're connected to. They prefer neutral or minimizing language that distances them emotionally and psychologically from the horror of what happened, rather than saying, "I never thought he would be murdered. I never thought someone would kill him." Kelly uses passive, sanitized language. The act of murder becomes simply that way. He also adds, "I take it as a tragedy." This wording suggests emotional distance, as if this wasn't a personal tragedy, but simply an unfortunate event happening to someone else. Even now, while discussing the death of the man he worked with every day for 3 years, Kelly continues to keep himself detached. And once again, no real emotion, no sadness, no anger, no shock, just cold, clinical language. This type of linguistic distancing is often a sign of someone concealing deeper knowledge or involvement. In the interview, Michael Kelly was asked when he last saw Michael Gaine alive. His answer: "I don't want to get caught out. I think it was the 20th. I'd have to have a calendar in front of me. It was the 10th hour, at some point in the 10th hour." These few words may be the most revealing in the entire investigation. The phrase, "I don't want to get caught out," is not something an innocent person typically says when recalling honest memories. A truth teller might say, "I don't remember exactly. Let me try to get the date right. I believe it was around this day." But to say, "I don't want to get caught out," suggests that Kelly fears being exposed not for forgetting, but for being inaccurate in a way that might reveal something deeper. It shows anxiety, a worry that his version of events may not fully match facts that police could verify. If someone knows they're telling the truth, there's no real risk of being caught out. But if someone is trying to manage their story carefully, even small mistakes could unravel their version of events. Kelly goes on to give vague and uncertain timing. At some point in the 10th hour, he avoids giving a clear time frame. For investigators and linguistic experts, these types of answers often reveal what's called verbal leakage, unconscious signs that someone may be constructing or managing a narrative instead of simply recalling true memory. This moment, 5 simple words, has become one of the biggest red flags in the case so far. During the interview, Michael Kelly was asked how he thought Michael Gaine may have been killed. Instead of directly stating anything, Kelly responded with a highly unusual theory. It's possible somebody could have used a firearm to direct him to walk away into the, cover up the copious amount of trees and wilderness. This statement raises multiple red flags. First, the choice of words. Kelly says, "somebody, not the killer, not whoever did this." The word "somebody" leaves the door wide open. It could be anyone, even himself. He makes no attempt to distance himself from that somebody. Second, he introduces the possibility that the murder took place directly on the farm property. This is significant because while Gaine's remains were eventually found there, the full sequence of events leading to his death remains unclear. Kelly, however, volunteers the theory that Gaine was somehow marched off into the woods at gunpoint, even though investigators have never publicly confirmed this scenario. Third, Kelly uses hypothetical language rather than personal observation. It's possible. In criminal psychology, offering possible scenarios, especially ones not backed by evidence, is often a way of planting alternative narratives in the minds of both the public and investigators. By speculating aloud, Kelly subtly shifts focus away from himself and introduces the idea that this could have been the work of someone unknown, perhaps even an outside assailant. And yet, there is no evidence that anyone else was involved and no confirmed reports of firearms being used in Gaine's death. Why would Kelly suggest such a scenario? Is it an honest theory or an intentional distraction? This is where his language starts to leave fingerprints. As the interview continued, Michael Kelly was asked about his own whereabouts on the day Michael Gaine was believed to have been killed. Kelly admitted, "It seems plausible to suggest that this is the case. I want to point out that the property is very large. But not only that, the terrain is very, very varied. You could be 50 yards away from the barn and invisible down in the river valley." Let's break that down. First, Kelly says it is plausible that he was on the land when Gaine was murdered. Notice again, he doesn't firmly say yes or no. He uses logical, distancing language, plausible, as if analyzing someone else's case. Second, instead of saying, "I could have been," or "I was," Kelly switches to second-person phrasing. You could be 50 yards away. By using "you" instead of "I," Kelly avoids directly inserting himself into the scene. This kind of distancing language is common in deceptive speech patterns. Third, Kelly emphasizes the property's size and terrain, suggesting it's entirely possible for him to have been nearby without knowing anything about what was happening. But this raises the obvious question. If he was truly there, wouldn't he want to clearly explain where he was? Wouldn't an innocent man try to give police as much clarity as possible? Instead, Kelly offers generalized, vague geography. This leaves open the uncomfortable possibility. Kelly may have been close enough to witness or hear something, but is carefully avoiding details that could tie him directly to the murder scene. The careful use of words like plausible and second-person phrasing are subtle ways people sometimes avoid self-incrimination while still trying to sound cooperative. In the weeks following Michael Gaine's murder, rumors began to circulate in the Kenmare community. One rumor stood out. Michael Gaine may have planned to remove Michael Kelly from the farm property, potentially evicting him from both his job and his home. When Kelly was asked directly whether this was true, his response was revealing. "Well, if it's true, it's a secret to me because I was never told anything like that. I never heard any plausible reason why, when we were busy working these sheep and cattle and fixing vehicles. I never had any indication he wanted that to stop." Let's examine his words carefully. First, instead of clearly denying the rumor, Kelly says, "If it's true, it's a secret to me." That statement leaves the possibility open. He could have simply said, "No, that's not true. Michael never asked me to leave." But instead, he responds with uncertainty. Second, he adds, "I never heard any plausible reason why." Once again, that word returns, plausible. He does not firmly reject the idea. Instead, he focuses on reasons rather than outright facts. Third, he points out they were still busy working together. "We were busy working these sheep and cattle and fixing vehicles." This may sound cooperative, but it could also serve as a subtle defense, as if to say, "Why would Michael want me gone if we were still working together?" Finally, Kelly repeatedly uses negative phrasing. "I never heard." "I never had any indication." In statement analysis, people often use negative denials when avoiding direct truth-telling. Positive, straightforward statements are typically far more trustworthy. This exchange may suggest that Kelly was aware of potential tension, but is carefully sidestepping any clear acknowledgement of conflict between himself and Gaine. And if true, losing both employment and housing could have provided a serious personal motive. As the interview continued, Michael Kelly began introducing strange and unrelated theories, steering the conversation far away from himself. First, he accused the authorities of attempting to frame him. In my mind, there's an obvious attempt to try me in the public medium. They've been acting in a manner prejudicial to the case. It reveals their hand a bit to engage in a cover-up by misdirection. Notice the language. In my mind. Obvious attempt. Cover-up by misdirection. He offers no evidence, only his personal belief, and instead of focusing on facts, he starts painting himself as the victim of some larger conspiracy. Then he makes an even more bizarre suggestion that Gardai might have found something on the farm unrelated to Gaine's murder. Maybe they found an old cache of era weapons or explosives or gold. It could have been any of those things. Here, Kelly throws out what experts call breadcrumbs. These are speculative distractions. By introducing dramatic, unrelated possibilities, weapons, explosives, gold, he attempts to shift attention away from himself. Innocent people usually want to stick to facts. Guilty minds often scatter wild theories to confuse the narrative. Finally, Kelly escalates the conspiracy by suggesting that very powerful people may be involved. Whatever is going on up, there is connected at the very high levels of power in this country, because it would have taken very high levels of power to inaugurate a search of that magnitude. This dramatic claim ties his earlier grievance being investigated to shadowy forces far beyond the case itself. He says the search started 24 hours and 1 minute after the guy was last seen again, using distancing language by calling Michael Gaine simply the guy. What Kelly never does during all these wild theories is clear himself of involvement. Instead, he creates layer after layer of distraction, misdirection, and paranoia. And the more he talks, the more distant he becomes from the man who was murdered, as if Gaine is almost irrelevant to his story. Across both of his interviews, through hours of conversation, accusations, rumors, and speculation, one thing stands out above everything else. Michael Kelly never once directly says, "I did not kill Michael Gaine." Not even close. Instead, when asked about the investigation and why he wasn't charged, he says, "They didn't charge me because it is all nonsense. I do know there is no substance to it, and hence there is no charge based on it." Notice the wording. It is all nonsense. There is no substance to it. These are dismissive phrases, not denials of fact. In statement analysis, innocent people usually say simple, strong statements. "I didn't do it. I had nothing to do with it." But Michael Kelly never offers that. Even when discussing the possibility of future charges, he adds, "It seems to me as though if charges were to be forthcoming, they would have been immediately after the interrogation." Here again, he acknowledges in his own mind that charges could still come. And then he makes one last revealing slip. He refers to his police questioning as an interrogation. Gardai described their interaction as questioning. Kelly calls it an interrogation, a word that suggests more pressure, more fear, and more serious legal exposure. For investigators, this kind of language matters deeply. Throughout both interviews, Michael Kelly dodged emotional questions, minimized the brutality of the murder, introduced wild conspiracy theories, avoided placing himself near the crime, and most importantly, never once clearly denied involvement. In the world of criminal investigations, sometimes what you don't say is far louder than what you do. As Gardai continued their investigation into the brutal murder of Michael Gaine, one thing remains chillingly clear. Michael Kelly's words may be his biggest clue of all.